Hey everybody! In today's video, we are going to do a faux Chine Collé technique. And this is inspired by this week's Mixability Challenge, our mixed media challenge at Split Coast. So before I tell you what I'm doing, I'm going to read you the definition of Chine Collé. It's a technique used in conjunction with a printmaking process such as etching or lithography that results in a two-layered paper support. A tissue-thin paper cut to the size of the printing plate and a larger, thicker support paper below. Both the tissue and the support sheet are placed on top of the inked plate and run together through the printing press, sometimes with a thin layer of adhesive between them, to reinforce the bond produced through the pressure of the press. The process creates a subtle, delicate backdrop to the printed image. Chine is the French word for China, referring to the fact that the thin paper originally used with this technique was imported from China. In addition to China, paper was also imported from India or Japan. Collé is the French word for glued, which you might recognize as the base of the word collage. So in order to adapt this to stamping, I set up my MISTI with a sticky mat on bottom. I put a card front on that. I took the protective sheet that covers the sticky mat and I put that on top of the card front. So you can sort of see a reflection there. And what that allows me to do is put my tissue paper down and trace the shapes that I want to paint with my water brush and then tear out in roughly the shape of some of the elements of this background stamp. It's sort of like an offset printing technique in that the charm of it is that it's an inexact coloring of the images on your substrate. I love that look. I've always loved offset printing. And then I'm going to do some finishing techniques that are going to make it look more like Chine Collé. But I have the basic process here without a printing press, just with a MISTI, obviously, and a stamp. And I did not look at what everyone else had done for the Mixability Challenge, and it turns out that everybody has their own interpretation of Chine Collé for stamping. So I encourage you to go look at that challenge because it was a really fun exercise in creativity for us all to interpret a classic art technique and turn it into a stamping technique, which is one of my favorite things to do anyway. If you've watched my channel at all, you know that I love to apply art and photography techniques to stamping, and that just helps me come up with new ideas. So I've just spot chosen some color. I like this sort of complementary of the orange and the pale blue tissue paper. This also happens to be the tissue paper that I have, just whatever is from gifts or packing material in my closet. And so that guided me as well. Always just use what you have. Don't go buy tissue paper for this. You could also color white tissue paper with alcohol markers and then go through this process. Now, the reason that tissue paper is fun for this technique is you can see through it to the stamped image that is underneath this thin sheet of acetate that you're going to see me pull up right now. So I'll try to leave these mostly in the place where they are just to give me a guide for the collé part of this, which is the collaging of the tissue onto the base stamped image. So I just put a little bit of matte gel medium down and I pop the shape down and then cover it up with matte medium. This is so easy with the little silicone spatula, and it just pops that design. That little bit of color is so much fun. However, you can probably see already that the tissue paper does add a little bit of opacity to the design that's underneath it. And since classical Chine Collé is actually a printmaking technique, that's a problem that we have to solve in the stamping process. And so I'm solving it with the MISTI. So that is why the stamp is still set up in my MISTI exactly like it was when I stamped this. So you'll want to make sure that you put your sticky mat in the corner. You just saw there's a little bit of play there, but I stamped it with the sticky mat firmly in the corner. And when I go to stamp it again, it'll be in exactly the same place. And it'll just freshen up those lines that are a little tiny bit obscured by the tissue paper. Now you could just leave the tissue paper the way it is and not stamp on top of it too. It's not that big a difference, but I think you'll see why I did it when I go to stamp on top of it, because it really does just make the whole design pop. And it looks like the tissue paper is integrated into this design, which it would be in a true Chine Collé process. So I think that's kind of fun. I love nerding out on old classical art techniques like that and just taking apart that process and seeing how true I can be to it just with the tools that I have for stamping. So when I stamp on top, you'll see how much that just brightens up that design. This is such a fun, whimsical coloring book style of stamp that it really pops out with that second application of ink. The only thing is, make sure that the tissue paper is completely dry before you stamp, because you don't want your ink to kind of fuzz out because it's meeting a wet medium. So be sure it's completely dry. Now, if you have a newish sticky mat like this is, always peel the mat away from the paper instead of peeling the paper away from the mat. If you bend that mat away, you're much less likely to tear your paper. And over time, it'll become less sticky and you don't have to worry about it. So now I can just trim off the excess that's on that little flower. It's hanging over on the side. So don't worry if you go over. You'll just trim it off at the end and it's fine. And you can see how adorable and bright and happy that is. I've left myself a little bit of white space for my greeting, but I just love the way this looks. And of course you could add more. You could add fewer little pops of color, but the imperfection in this technique is really fun and really representative of the Chine Collé technique. So you can go look up examples of fine artists practicing Chine Collé, and maybe you'll come up with a different technique for doing it. But I do love this one, and it's super easy. So I added a sentiment with some alphabet dies to this. I hope you've enjoyed this. Head over to my blog for more information and a link to this challenge. And thanks so much for watching.